This is a Psychology Today cassette, one in a series of interviews and special presentations featuring contemporary clinicians, researchers, and educators discussing their work in the behavioral and social sciences. Today, editorial director Margie Norman talks with Dr. Arnold A. Lazarus as he takes the listener through a series of exercises in self-directed imagery and explains how his techniques can solve many problems and enrich our lives. Margie Norman opens the discussion.
Dr. Lazarus, although we all have imaginations, some livelier than others, most of us may not be getting the best use out of them. Can you tell us a bit about what you call self-directed imagery and what it can do?
The idea of self-directed imagery is for people very deliberately to think about the pictures that they have formed and go with these pictures. So if we are saying to somebody who, let's say, is afraid of something that they've got to do in the near future, well, work it out in your mind. What we mean in self-directed imagery is the person would actually spend the time to picture the real event and to enable that event to go the way they want it to go, at least in imagination. Then you have a self-fulfilling prophecy that can be put to good effect. So that's one idea of self-directed imagery. It means that we use our pictures for specific purposes. And on this particular tape, I hope to give you a number of different examples of how we can use different imagery exercises to achieve different ends.
Wonderful. Before we do that, though, can you now lead us through a simple exercise in imagination that will help us get in touch with our own capacities to make visual mental images?
Sure. My favorite one is the following one. Think of the house you grew up in as a child, that house which you regard as your childhood home. You may have lived in many different houses, but most people have a particular house, and they associate that house as being their childhood home. Picture that house. Now, from the outside, count the windows in that house. Just spend a few moments and count the windows. Okay, now as long as the image was clear enough for you to get some idea, some memory, so that you could actually go through the motions of counting, that is all the vividness that we require for you to derive benefit from imagery procedures. If you found that you really could not do this, if you found that you couldn't find a particular home in your mind's eye, or if you had one that it was so hazy, so fuzzy, so indistinct that you just couldn't count the windows, then I would say that you first need to spend some time trying to improve your imagery capacity. I would say that most people, however, can do the exercise.
Well, let's assume, though, that some of us do feel we want to make our images clearer, make them come quicker to us, make imaging easier. Is there something that we can do to strengthen our imaging ability?
Sure. My number one favorite exercise for strengthening imagery ability is to look at a picture, any picture, and study the picture for a few minutes, and then to close your eyes, and then to visualize it, to pretend that you are still looking at it, to see how clearly you can recollect all the things in the picture. And then to open your eyes and again look at the actual picture and see what you had forgotten, what you were unable to picture, and then again to close your eyes and to repeat the exercise, trying to picture it, and to do this with different pictures or different objects. And then see whether or not you begin to find that you get a clearer capacity to visualize things in your mind's eye. That's my number one favorite exercise.
Let's let listeners practice that if they would like. Turn off the tape and practice some of these things as we're going through. But now we're going to move on. Let's go on to some more exercises. And as we go through each one, Dr. Lazarus, I would appreciate it if you could first suggest how each might best be used for what purposes before you go into the instructions or the explanations. And the first one that we want to cover is called associated imagery.
Okay, now associated imagery is best used for self-discovery, for finding missing links. Quite often we feel a certain way, react a certain way, and we don't know why. And we'd like to try and discover what it's all about to make sense out of it. And that's where associated imagery really comes into its own.
All right, could you give me an example of how you have used that, either in your practice or in your own life?
Sure, let me tell you about a young man I had seen in therapy whose main problem was a fear of commitment, a fear of involvement. He said he would like to get married, but in fact his behavior didn't support that. He would take out women, become friendly, become intimate, and then when things were getting too hot and heavy, he would invariably break off the relationship. And this was bothering him because he was now in his 30s and felt he'd like to settle down. And he was at that time dating a very, very nice young woman. And he wanted so much to marry her, but he could feel his threshold being reached, where he'd soon break it off because this was his pattern. And he wondered what this was all about. He was truly perplexed. Now, when using associated imagery, what one does is one starts with the very problem that the person is unable to solve. So with him, we said, imagine that you are married. And you start with that, you see, that's the clue. And then you see what kinds of images come to mind. So I said to him, you are married, look at the marriage certificate. What's the image that comes into your mind? And he said, I see a church. And then you go with the church. I said, okay, focus in on the church. See the church. What is it about the church? And he paused and he said, the organ. I see the organ in the church. Fine. You go with each particular image. You focus in on that one. See the organ in the church. I said, focus in on the organ. Like using a zoom lens. You sort of go right into the object. What happens then? He says, Phantom of the Opera. I said, what does that mean? And he said, the movie, Phantom of the Opera, this creature playing the organ with a mask on his face. Focus in on Phantom of the Opera. He said, a bus ride to the beach. Now you see how amazing these associated images are. What is the connection? No one knows for sure, but there it was, a bus ride to the beach. How old are you? He said, I'm 12. Onto the bus, you are riding to the beach. What's the next image? He said, my girlfriend, her name was June. Oh, okay, focus in on your girlfriend, June. What now? He says, the piano. The piano, he was going to be a concert pianist. And he was now focusing in on the piano. Focus in, what do you see? My mother. My mother telling me to practice. And he said, my mother was always telling me to practice, practice, practice. And this really bugged me. Okay, focus in on your mother saying practice, practice, practice. What do you see? And he said, again, I see my girlfriend, June. Okay, focus in on June. Now what do you see? And he said, gee, I had that accident where I broke my hand. And he described an accident where he had fractured his hand very badly. And then he had quit the piano. Now, this led to an interesting discussion where he said, gee, I wonder whether in my mind I associate involvement with tragedy, because the connection between the broken hand and June is a very definite one now that we've spoken about this. And he said, could it be that I have this link in my mind that involvement with a woman is going to result in some loss in my life? And this is what we began to explore in his therapy, but there's an example of associated imagery. Now, what any one of us can do at any time when we are puzzled about our reactions is to just go from image to image. And very often a pattern, a mosaic unfolds. And a lot of people who have done this have said to me that they've been really surprised to see the pieces form and fall together. Now, of course, there's nothing original about this idea. Many years ago, William James had written about the stream of consciousness. Sigmund Freud, of course, was very heavily into free association. But imagery association, associated imagery, is even more rapid and powerful than these other means of getting at missing links, hidden meanings. And it can be very exciting, and people can do this on their own.
So it's truly a way to begin rediscovering oneself. Let's go to the second kind of imagery, which you say can be very useful, and that you call positive imagery. What is that used for?
Right, positive imagery is so much more powerful than positive thinking. Positive imagery is based upon a very straightforward reality, which is when you go into a positive scene, you produce positive changes throughout your body. It has a physiological impact. And going into positive images can be one of the most powerful healing mechanisms. Again, I would say that every day all of us should spend some time in a positive image, which could be anything. You see, your positive image could be something as ordinary as a warm, sandy beach with a beautiful blue sky, and somebody else's positive image could be something very exotic, a subtropical island, who knows what, a trip to Mars, a journey on a spaceship, being tucked into bed by one's mother. Whatever the positive image is, go with it. It's not a bad idea to get a number of positive images, to think about 3 or 4 different positive images, and to go there from time to time. I had a very, very frustrated executive who was finding the pressure of work overwhelming, and suggested to him that between various meetings he spend some time in a positive image. His positive image was a farm scene, and he described this farm scene to me very vividly. The green pastures, the animals, and there was always a kind of a warm, pleasant feeling, a sort of a drowsy Sunday afternoonish kind of a aura to this. And here was this very, very busy individual who would stop for 2 or 3 minutes, sit down, relax his body, and imagine that he's now on this beautiful farm. And he said this would recharge his batteries. He would take a 2 to 3 minute break. He would say to his secretary, no calls for 2 to 3 minutes, get into his positive image, and then surface again and go back to work refreshed. And this is something I would advise most people to try. Positive imagery has a tremendously positive effect on all levels of functioning.
To make it a little clearer how one might use this, could you do one with us right now?
Sure. The thing to do is, let me do this with you. And I hope the listener will just follow along with us and do this for him or herself. Spend a few moments thinking of any scene that you would find very pleasant and positive. And when you have the scene, just let me know by nodding your head. Okay, now, what I want you to do is to just let your body go heavy. That is to say, don't tense. Enjoy the pleasant feeling of the force of gravity. Okay, just go limp. Let yourself feel pleasantly heavy. Enjoy the feeling of the force of gravity, a pleasant feeling. Now, go to that positive image. Just go right into it and stay there as vividly as possible. So when I stop talking, you are not sitting here talking to me, but really feel that you are in your positive image. Now, if we had you wired up to a polygraph that would be measuring blood pressure, heart rate, and other functions, if you did that thoroughly, reasonably vividly, we would find evidence of positive effects upon your body. And, of course, you had about a 15-second exposure. You can do this much longer. I mean, what you might want to do is turn off the tape recorder and go back into your positive image for as long as you like, and then gradually come out of it. That's how simple it is. But doing this, just going into the positive image in a relaxed state, is a wondrous thing.
It not only relaxes you, but as you said before, it does recharge one's batteries.
It does indeed.
Energizes you. Our third type of imagery that our listeners might like to learn about and try is where you project yourself into the future. You call this anti-future shock. Can you describe that and its uses?
Yes, a lot of people are taken by surprise, unpleasant surprises. Suddenly they realize that their children have left home and they are faced with a so-called empty nest, or suddenly they realize that they are going to be facing retirement soon, or with younger couples, suddenly they realize that they are now parents and they were, as it were, taken unawares. What happened? Where did this come from? And they are then in a state of what Toffler, in a different context, would call future shock, because suddenly they are there and it's happened without any preparation. To avoid this, and I have found, by the way, that a lot of people who tend to benefit from therapy and then relapse because the therapist did not prepare them for events that were going to be happening. So this is the way one does the anti-future shock. You think about the probable changes over the next 5 years. So let's say if the listener is 17 or 18 years old, probably in the next 5 years he or she might marry. This is a probability. Or finish school, or something of that kind, you see. And you think about the realities. People who are somewhat older might think about having children, or might think about moving to a different location, things that are likely to happen in the next 5 years in your life. And then what you do, as you think about these things, it's good to jot them down. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to probably finish college, then I'm going to be looking for a job, then I'm going to be getting a job, and then Susie and I might settle down and get married, and we might even have a couple of kids. I mean, this could all happen in the next 5 years. Fine. The person then pictures these things actually happening. You visualize each one of these events as clearly as possible. Now, a funny thing happens. I've had people, when they've done that, like they've visualized the child coming, the baby coming, this has really upset them in the image. And then they say, goodness me, I didn't realize that this is very upsetting. And then they focus in on that, often with associated imagery, and out comes a message to them about their preparedness, their readiness, their non-readiness, what these things mean. You see, the trouble with most of us is we think about these things fleetingly. We don't really think about them very thoroughly. Now, with anti-future shock, by going into the most likely changes and picturing them happening, you are preparing yourself, you are readying yourself. And if there are certain things that you can change so that these things will not happen, fine, you've got better control. It also helps to prepare one for the inevitable. The cliche about growing old gracefully is something that can only be done if somebody has prepared in their mind's eye a trajectory that is acceptable to them, where they've begun to see some of the advantages rather than all the disadvantages. And when they reach that point, they've been there before. That is to say, they've rehearsed it. They've practiced it in imagery. It doesn't come as a shock. They are ready for it. It's an emotional fire drill. You know how the captain of the ship says, we're going to have a fire drill, everybody put on your life vest, come on deck, and in the event of a fire, this is what we'll do. Well, an emotional fire drill is tied into anti-future shock, where we think about the things that are going to happen and prepare ourselves for them in advance.
And part of that process, I assume, is getting in touch with the feelings that those images evoke.
Absolutely. Funny things happen. A fellow who went to visit his old hometown was absolutely devastated when he went to look up an old restaurant and discovered that a major highway was now where the restaurant used to stand, you see, and felt that a part of his soul had suddenly been ripped out. And then he looked around and he realized, my God, I'm suddenly 50. Where did the past 30 years go, you see? And who are these grown-up daughters? Where did they come from? I'm exaggerating some, you see, but he had not really sat down and thought through things and the feelings that go with them very clearly.
Let's go on now. After anti-future shock, we come to another interesting name. This one you call time-tripping imagery.
Right, now time tripping can take you forward or backward in time. There are a lot of things that people regret in the past. there are a lot of things that they would like to have done differently. Now, with time tripping, one can go back in imagination into the past and picture oneself doing these things differently. This prepares you, of course, for the present and the future. Also, sometimes using a technique that Gestalt therapists call unfinished business. If there are people sometimes who are no longer alive, who one feels unfinished about, the dialogues have not been completed, there might be guilt feelings, and people go into a dialogue with these individuals. They often come away feeling a lot better about it, so that one of my clients whose aunt had died some years back, this aunt was a very important person in her life, and she felt very guilty because she felt that maybe if she had been around at the time of her aunt's demise, she would not have died.
This completes the first part of our discussion. We continue on side 2. We now continue our discussion with Arnold A. Lazarus.
So what happened in the time tripping, she went back in time and discussed this with her aunt, who reassured her that this was absurd, that she couldn't possibly have done anything differently. And she felt better. Now, that may sound trite. One would say, how can such a simple technique make her feel better? The truth is that there was a part of her mind that hadn't accepted that was saying, no, 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 this is what you should have done, this is what you should have done. And by going back in time, in the time tripping, that part, as it were, was laid to rest. It also is very useful to go back in time to pleasant memories. If one has a very pleasant memory of a time in the past, it is like the positive imagery we discussed earlier. You go back to that pleasant era in the past and bathe in it, as it were, so that you come out feeling energized and refreshed. This is another use of the time tripping into the past. You can do it in stages if you want to, or you can do it very rapidly if you prefer to. That is to say, you can go back in time however old you are. Let's say that you are 20, you can go back to age 10, age 5 in one flash.
By recalling or visualizing something at that time in your life, is that how you get
That's
back?
a very good way of doing it. If you can think of something that happened and go and you are now there. Or you can take a time machine and go back as an adult to yourself as a child and give yourself a certain amount of reassurance. With some people, this really frees them up from a lot of guilt and misery when they are told by their own alter egos, grown up, that they're okay. That kind of message is a very reassuring one.
Now, what is the best way for somebody to prepare to do this? Is this the kind of thing that you need a quiet room, a quiet setting, and to be alone?
Ideally, for any of the imagery exercises, you need to be in a reasonably quiet place where you are not going to be disturbed by people barging in, phones ringing, and so on. And you want to be able to sit comfortably and to relax and to close your eyes and to feel reasonably secure. Those are the best conditions for practicing any of the imagery exercises.
All right, now, time tripping backwards. We can also time trip forwards.
That's often very useful when people are feeling mildly depressed. Usually, when something has gone badly for us in the present, we might feel down, a bit blue, a bit depressed. Tripping into the future, where we see ourselves a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the road, looking back on the event, enables us to shrink it into perspective, because we all have had the experience of reacting very strongly to something that's happening now. But 6 months later, when we look back at it, we say, what was the big deal, you see? So indeed, if I discover that someone has dented the fender of my car now, I'm going to be very upset. And if I continue to be upset, a good idea would be for me to use some future tripping, where I'm remembering it now 6 months later. So what is it? It's an inconvenience. I don't have to be so upset. And a lot of people find that this really does help them come out of these mild depressions. I'm saying mild depressions because some depressions require medical treatment. They require antidepressant medication. But for the ordinary everyday blues and irritations that we experience, going forward in time, pretending it is now 6 months later, and looking back does shrink the event.
And one way you can do that is if it's the summertime when you got your fender dented, you can think, all right, now it's winter and the snow is on the ground and the trees have lost their leaves. Whatever it is that will indeed make that 6-month period really be alive so that then you can look back.
That's very good, yes. If we are talking in midsummer and it's going to be midwinter in 6 months, we can picture ourselves in the winter time 6 months later, looking back at something that happened in the summertime and saying, so what, who cares?
Let's go on now to another method that you can use to help in your self-improvement through visualization, the idealized self.
Okay, this is part of what's called success-oriented images. And the idealized self-image, which was developed by Dr. Dorothy Susskind, is a very useful way of enabling people to deal with self-esteem difficulties. Now, the way it's done is you start off by relaxing as comfortably as you can, and then you close your eyes and you picture yourself possessing various qualities and skills that you would like to have. Now, what's very important here is this: it's no good to select an idealized self-image that is beyond your capacity. You try to see yourself attaining various attributes that can actually be achieved in a relatively short time period. And you try to be very specific. There's no point in saying, I want to see myself as successful, because successful is too vague. So instead, what you want to do is see yourself developing poise or intellectual curiosity or a better way of relating to people, something specific. And then you see yourself in your mind's eye contrasting the idealized self-image, let's call that the ISI, with your actual self-image. That contrast is important because that enables you to set specific goals so that you can participate actively toward achieving the new behaviors you desire. Part of the self-confidence building is recalling something that you did quite well, and that's usually a good way of doing this. You dwell on that incident, something you did quite well, and you recapture whatever feelings of achievement and accomplishment you can muster. Then you transfer and extend this feeling of achievement into your ongoing activities. You apply to anything you are doing at present and plan to do in the immediate future. And you keep on bringing your ISI into clear focus. Whatever you are doing, talking to friends, walking down the street, attending a business meeting, you identify with your ISI, your idealized self-image. When you discover a discrepancy between your real self, what you are actually doing, feeling, thinking, and responding, and your ideal self, you ask yourself exactly what you are doing that is incorrect. See, how do you want to change what you are doing? You picture yourself changing your tactics, and you begin to act and feel more like your ISI. Now, let me give you a brief case outline. There was a 24-year-old woman who was overweight and anxious about speaking in class. She was taking a course in English literature, and she was inclined to feel awkward in many social situations. Now, her idealized self-image differed from her actual self-image in three main respects. First, she saw herself as slim in the idealized image rather than fat. She imagined herself asking questions and making comments in class, and she pictured herself being calm and relaxed at social gatherings. So these were the three main differences between the real and the imagined self. Now, she kept this idealized self-image in her mind whenever she had a moment to think about it. Day after day, she vividly saw herself being slim and non-anxious. Slowly, her positive image started transferring to the actual situations. So when she is tempted to eat fattening foods, she would think of her ISI and adhere to her diet, you see, because she'd see that slim self and realize, I'm not going to get there. So there the ISI acted as a deterrent, you see. In class, she pictured her ISI and took the risk of speaking up on a few occasions. This led her to feel much more at ease in class, and she took similar risks socially. She said that she would usually refrain from asking strangers any questions, but because in her ISI she would see herself acting very differently, she decided to act more like what she called the new me. And then she added, I'm glad I did. Now, when we focus on our mistakes, you see, this is the main point behind the ISI. When we focus on our mistakes, when we dwell on our inadequacies, when we think about our rejections, our limitations, our shortcomings, our drawbacks, we end up expecting to fail, and this negative view becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The ISI technique provides the essential ingredients for the development of a more constructive lifestyle, so that you are now developing a new expectancy. Instead of failure, you are building in success. And there are many other techniques that fit into the ISI technique, such as at any time that we use associated imagery, we can stop and then try to inject ourselves into that image, doing a positive thing, seeing a constructive outcome, you see, so that the whole thrust is very, very positive. So these techniques that I've mentioned here all dovetail, they fit together. They are not discrete and separate, but one can potentiate the other, and people can tune into any one or more as they see fit.
To go back to the specific idealized self-image, that is an exercise, it seems to me, that one can carry around with you all day long. When you have indeed decided what you want to be or how you want to look to yourself, then you can always be thinking of that.
At any time, you can carry that idealized self-image with you. And when you are in a situation and you are not acting according to that, you tune into the idealized self-image and see how you would rather be doing it, and then try to match the idealized self in the actual situation. That is the way that it works best.
All right, now that we have run through a variety of imaging techniques that can be used for several purposes, which we have mentioned, we've also suggested that relaxation, quietness is important to the success of most of these. So I would like you now, Dr. Lazarus, to give us a directed exercise in relaxation which will help us prepare ourselves to do these imaging exercises.
Fine, I think that's important. We can go to the end of the tape with some specific relaxation training. What you would need for this is a comfortable bed, couch, or chair where you can sit back so that you are fully supported. So that's the first thing, is to be sure that you are sitting down or lying down as comfortably as possible. Now, start by taking in a deep breath. Breathe in, fill your lungs, hold the breath, and now exhale, breathe out. Now notice as you breathe out, there is a calming effect. Now just spend the next few moments taking in a few deep breaths and letting them out slowly. Breathe in slowly, hold it, and then just exhale slowly. And notice as you breathe out that it intensifies the calming effects. Do that for a few moments. All right, now just to appreciate some of the differences between tension and relaxation, let's do a few contrast exercises. Just make a fist with both hands. Clench your fists and feel the tension in the hands and fingers. Keep the fists clenched. Try to relax the rest of your body and notice that localized tension in the hands and fist, quite unpleasant by contrast. Now open your fist. Let your hands go loose. Put them down at your sides and feel the difference. Now I want you to imagine from the hands, which could feel quite tingly after that, that there is a very pleasant sensation of tingly warmth that can spread from your hands up your arms and very pleasantly into the rest of your body. Now, the best thing is to have your eyes closed so you have no surface tensions, eyes closed, and the body loose and relaxed, a pleasant, heavy sensation that comes with the relaxation. Look for any pleasant tingly sensations, any pleasant warm sensations as the body just relaxes and loosens up. A pleasant, warm, heavy feeling goes with the relaxation. Now I'm going to call out various parts of your body. As I mention each part, just feel it smoothing out with relaxation. We'll start with your forehead and scalp, so that your forehead and scalp smooth out. And the smooth, relaxed sensation covers your eyes, your nose, your cheeks, your jaws, your lips, tongue, and mouth, so that there is a relaxed feeling in the face and head. Now feel the relaxation going down the neck and throat, down the shoulders, down to the tips of your fingers, so that your arms feel heavy, right up to the shoulders, neck, and head. Now feel the relaxation also in your chest, right through to your upper back, and down your sides over your stomach, into hips, buttocks, and thighs, down to the calves, ankles, and toes, so that you feel the entire body pleasantly heavy, with warm sensations coming and going. And let this deepen. Just let this deepen. Every time you breathe out for the next few moments, just think the word calm. So breathe normally, but as you exhale for the next few moments, think the word calm. Now that's the level of relaxation, if you have followed the instructions that most people need to benefit from the imagery techniques to their maximum. Just a few minutes on your own. You don't have to play the tape once you know the sequence of just letting go, doing a little bit of tension, relaxation, taking a few deep breaths, letting the relaxation spread over each part of the body, and then just thinking the word calm or any other word that you prefer as you breathe out will produce that level of relaxation that will enable you to derive maximum benefit from the imagery techniques.
Dr. Lazarus, to encourage our listeners in their attempts and to let them know that imagery really can be beneficial, it might be nice to conclude by having you describe how these exercises and others like them have actually helped persons that you know.
All right, I'll talk about a few specific instances and show you how different types of images made a big difference to their lives. I'm thinking of one man who consulted me with a drinking problem. Now, I don't know whether he could be called an alcoholic, but he was certainly abusing alcohol, and this was a big problem in his life. Well, with him, I used aversive imagery, and the aversive imagery was getting him to visualize himself really becoming violently ill and throwing up any time he exceeded 2 normal drinks. 2 normal drinks would mean 2 beers, 2 ordinary shots of hard liquor, and that was it. If he then took a third, he was to imagine himself becoming violently ill, throwing up, absolutely, practically dying. And he went along with this very, very religiously, and has found that this has really kept his drinking in moderation. This worked very, very well for him. Now, I also was consulted by an exhibitionist, and he was getting into a lot of trouble because he would be exposing himself to various people, and he was arrested one time, and this compulsion also was brought under control by aversive imagery. The picture there was that he would be arrested, he'd be charged, thrown in jail, and the thing that did it for him, he was very, very attached to a younger brother. And I had a zoom lens go into the younger brother's eyes in imagery and see the hurt in this kid at what his brother had done. That aversive image acted as a very strong deterrent in his case. Now, the use of positive imagery worked very well. In fact, just this last week, a patient who had high blood pressure has had various medications, has tried meditation, which he heard was very good, and nothing was really helping him. And increasing the medication was producing other problems for him. So I suggested positive imagery, using a pleasant scene that he could go to. And in fact, he found 6 pleasant scenes, and he would go from one to the other from time to time. And lo and behold, this past week I learned that for the first time ever, his blood pressure is well within normal limits, and he's beginning to decrease his medication. So that's another success story that is very encouraging. Now, finally, I used a very interesting goal rehearsal technique with an individual who was a swimmer. She was competing in high school swimming, and the coaches kept saying she could do better, she could do better. And what I suggested to her was that she practice goal rehearsal, seeing herself swimming, seeing herself bettering her time, seeing herself, whatever she had to do, doing it faster and better. And she also told me that she now has made the team for the very first time, and everyone's very excited. And she says there's no doubt in her mind that using imagery, seeing herself bettering her performance, really worked. So those few case vignettes, I hope, will give some sort of three-dimensional view and encourage people to try imagery in their own lives.
And I think in conclusion we can say it isn't necessarily going to come easy. You must practice, practice, practice. But if you do, you're likely to find a very beneficial payoff. Thank you very much, Dr. Arnold A. Lazarus.
This concludes our discussion with Dr. Arnold A. Lazarus. You have been listening to one in a series of Psychology Today cassettes on subjects in the behavioral and social sciences.